Greetings, ladies and gentlefish, and welcome back to some more of, I don't know, me trying to show some of the stuff I painted, I guess. Go figure. Those of you who don't remember or don't know, this is kind of part of a desire to try and actually get through all those piles of shame that we all have. It doesn't matter what hobby you do. If you do a hobby, you're pretty much guaranteed to have this, whether it be books, whether it be unwatched TV shows, it could be whatever. In this case, it's going to be a bunch of plastic crack, but whatever it is, you've got it. So we're trying to get through a bunch without buying loads more stuff, because sitting here, literally have a wardrobe full of boxes. And it ain't all painted. So, there we go. That's what we're trying to do here. We're going to be having a look at the stuff that was done in Q2 of this year, which is a very fancy way of saying April, May, and June. So let's have a look. Firstly, there's a couple of bits of scenery, like scenic bases. I'm just showing the one here. This is stuff that Loki actually did the early work on and then asked me to paint a few bits and bobs. So they're both, the ones we've made so far, they've kind of got this sort of Dartmoor thing going on. The idea is it's sort of a boggy, wet plot of land which has had something horrible happen in the past, and so you got bits of stuff poking out of the soil, and you've got a collection of helmets. And what actually doesn't come out particularly well in this picture is there's a pool of blood underneath those helmets that I've tried to paint so that it doesn't look necessarily fresh. Or at least not all of it is fresh, so it's kind of a little bit been there at least a short while. But yeah, anyway, these are just, the idea is that these will just be nice little bits of scatter terrain that for any of your war games you can just throw on a table and be like, hey, there's a couple of bits of terrain that, whilst they might not obscure line of sight or whatnot, they can be some difficult to cross for your infantry or whatever it is. So that's what we've got first up. And it was actually quite nice to be able to paint some different stuff here. Of all the things I've been painting lately, it's been a lot of kind of greens and metallics. So it was nice to paint one of these helmets just a lurid pink. That was quite satisfying. What I've gone for here is that, so for those of you who know 40k at all, there are 4 main chaos gods who are often depicted as the primary antagonists of the setting, or some of the primary antagonists. I have quite a large force of Death Guard, which are a bunch of Chaos Space Marines dedicated to good old Papa Nurgle, who's into disease and decay and whatnot. And so I painted each of the 3 heads here to be from a different one of those Chaos Gods. So you've got the sort of red armor with the kind of brassy trim that's more associated with Khorne, who likes murdering things. You've got the blue and gold of Tzeentch, who's sort of into magic and change and trickery. And then you've got the pink, and I did silver, of Slaanesh, Emperor's Children. And they're kind of into debauchery and excess in all its glory. So there we go. That was kind of the logic behind that. Anyway, that's the first thing. It's just a bit of terrain, but a little bit of fun there. A lot of the models I'm going to show you are me painting up a whole bunch of Necrons, but we'll get to that in a moment. So this is a trio of models. These are not Games Workshop models. These are actually from a company called Mears Miniatures, who perhaps fittingly are also based in Nottingham along with GW, but whatever. These are not Games Workshop models. I wanted some Chaos Spawn. So in the lore, Spawn, you take a usually person, doesn't have to be, but whatever. You mutate them horribly and you get this sort of hulking, grotesque thing going on. The problem I find is that the current Games Workshop Spawn models, they're a bit on the old side, and frankly, they just don't quite do it for me. I like my twisted, chaotic abominations to have some body horror going on, or to have something weird, for you to look at them and go, ugh, what is that? So these guys As I say, I found Mias Miniatures, and at the time, they'd just brought out, I think, the Midden Beasts, which is what these models actually are. So these are resin miniatures. And as they were, I think it was, they'd just brought them out. Well, whatever the reason was, they were at a significantly discounted price compared to what they'd usually be. So I really like the sculpts. I picked them up. These, to me, feel like they've kind of been bodged together from whatever happens to be floating around in your, nearest neighbourhood swamp. Or midden, I suppose, burial mound, or detritus pile, or whatever you happen to go with here. So you've got some tentacles, you've got kind of bony, I've painted them bone, you've got faces, you've got bits of skeleton and bone that have been mushed together. Some of them have hooves, some of them don't even have feet, they've just got a giant mouth in their belly and bits of branch, and it just makes me happy. So these are my Chaos Spawn. I had a lot of fun painting these guys, and hats off to the chaps over at Mias Miniatures. They're a much smaller company than you often see people buy miniatures from, but they were really cool. I'd actually already painted the miniatures, but the bases I hadn't at the time, so that was kind of what I worked on here. So what I tried to do for the bases, again, is I'm trying to go for this kind of wet, mud, boggy sort of look. So you can see we've got a skull that's just been left there. You've got some little tufts of grass, but it's not everywhere. Picked up some mud effect texture paste from AK Interactive, and also another AK product, some sort of still water effect. It's basically a resin, I think. But you get this sort of fairly chunky bottle of it. It does make me giggle with a lot of these products. Games Workshop sell them, for example. And you look at it and you're like, right, so I can either get this tiny little tub of, for example, texture paste or pot of texture paste from Games Workshop, or I can get massively more and pay maybe a similar amount of money or less or whatever from a different company. So I got my texture paste from AK Interactive, and of course, fundamentally, let's be honest, what is texture paste? It's basically some sand, PVA and paint mushed together, and what I've done in the past is made up my own bit. Sometimes it doesn't always feel quite right, but you can definitely experiment with your own stuff. Anyway, that's kind of the feel I was going for with these guys. This is the chap who just doesn't have feet. He's just got a giant mouth. Go figure. The Chaos Space Marine helmet you can see there, it's actually from the Dark Vengeance, what are they called, Deathwing Terminator sets. They give you these little pieces to go on the bases, and this was when I clipped off one of those bases. It's just supposed to be like a bit of scenery anyway. Clipped off one of those bases and whacked on here. And they've got some grotesque gribbliness going on. And then I think this guy's actually my favourite sculpt. You can't see it very well in this angle, but his right arm kind of looks like it's bits of skeleton and bone, and there's a sort of scythe, bony, well, I've painted it bony, and then his left arm kind of is more tree branch, and again, it's just all this stuff has been mushed together, and I really like these models. I think they're really cool. And I gave this guy a bit more water, a couple more tufts of grass, but yeah, so they are my Chaos Spawn, finally finished, and I always have fun putting these guys on the table. They're, I don't know, the sculpts just... Sorry? Yeah, so anyone who doesn't know anything about Chaos Spawn, because they're supposed to be horribly mutated things, the idea is that you never really know what they're going to do. So when you use them in a game, they tend to have sort of random effects and random numbers of attacks. Back in the day, if we just bear with me a moment and travel back 20 years when I was first thinking of making a Chaos Army of some description. Yeah, about 20 years. Jeez. Anyway, sometimes those random effects could be negative, so you could, or just not very useful in your situation. So you'd roll something and you might get, I don't know, the spawn has a hideous mutation and loses a wound or something like that. I can't remember the exact effects, or they don't move as quickly. These days, they are all positive effects. That doesn't always mean that they're particularly useful in a given situation, but they are all positive effects. And to say, the number of attacks is random, which can be just hilarious. Like, in a game, these guys are cheap, they're cheerful. I mean, look at the models. How can you say they're anything other than cheerful? Or at least the models I'm using. They're cheap, they're cheerful, they're fun. And I always find, if you're using models this is in any sort of game, if you're using stuff that's not from the manufacturer that makes that game, it just catches people's attention and they're like, oh, what's that? It's a nice little conversation point. I usually these days play games with friends of mine, but in the past I have definitely, gone down a local game store and had random pickup games. And as I say, it's just a nice little talking point. And they're like, oh, that's a cool model. Where did that come from? Of course, Games Workshop these days seem to have decided that that's a terrible thing, but, I don't care. So yeah, they're my Chaos Spawn. I love these guys. I've waffled on about them for far too long, but I love them. They're awesome. They're my friends. You're my friends. Anyway, moving onward. So I've got it's called a Hellbrute these days, but a Dreadnought. Again, we're talking Chaos here. The model's actually painted, but I had some arms floating around. I was like, I could do some stuff here. So I did some conversions and whatnot. So this was the result. We've got on the left of the picture, that's actually an arm taken from a Loyalist Ironclad Dreadnought, I think it is, and I have found a spare heavy flamer and some fuel tanks that I had lying around and just glued it on the bottom, because who doesn't like more flamethrowers onto their horrible mashy close combat weapon things? Rule of cool, right? The middle one, this is a piece I've actually had in a while. Now, this was not entirely painted this time round, which is why you can see there are bits where it's not painted very well, or there's bits of resin showing. This is a resin piece mostly. So this was from Forge World. I picked it up at the time for something else, but I decided I'd repurpose it, and it's kind of a close combat weapon with a giant chain blade, which is always fun. And again, I just slapped a spare heavy flamethrower on the side with some fuel tanks on the back, because it's fun and it looks cool. Then over on the side, you've got a twin las cannon, and I tried my hand, as you might be able to see, a little bit of specular reflection on the lens of it. So there's a little white dot up in the corner that's supposed to be kind of a reflection point, but these were just relatively quick to chuck out, and just some more weapon options for the model in question. And now I think, yeah, we're getting onto the Necrons. So this is what I've spent a lot of the time in this time period painting. I've got quite a large, for anyone who doesn't know, sorry. Necrons are sort of murder death bots. They were based, aesthetically, they were based quite heavily on the Terminator franchise, way back in the dawny mists of time. These guys originally came out in the 90s. And they used to have a special rule called "We'll be back." You can see where they're going with that. These days, it's been renamed to something that's more trademarkable, I suppose. But it's now, reanimation protocols? But there's just something so satisfying about your opponent having their turn, and then you just get to go, oh, and all my murder death bots are dead. Or are they? Excuse me, we'll be back. And some of them stood back up. It was just so fun. Anyway, so I've got quite a large collection of these guys, and I decided that I wasn't happy with the way that teenage me had painted them, so I'm going to repaint them all. Yay! Some people don't like doing that because they say, oh, you want to have evidence of what you were like as a painter earlier on so you can see you've improved. And I get that. I do totally get it. But I don't care. So my logic, if you couldn't hear Loki in the background, is I use these in games. I like to play games with them. And I like to have them on display here or there. I think that's quite cool. You're showing, let's be honest, you're showing your artwork to people at that point. And I like to have them out and go, you know what? They don't look like garbage. I know I've improved as a painter, and I'm going to show you some pickies in a minute of what some of these guys look like when I did originally paint them. But I know I've gotten better. I don't need to prove that. Anyway, these are these are scarab bases. I just fundamentally love scarabs. They're just so much fun. So what these guys are, if you imagine the replicators from Stargate, yeah, they're them. These tiny little robotic scuttling, insect, scarab-looking things. Yeah, builder-bugs. And, they're just so fun in-game, and you can make them self-destruct, and Oh, I love them. I love them so much. This has got to be one of my favourite units in the entirety of 40k, whether from a lore perspective or in-game or whatever. I just think they're so cute. Anyway, they're really quick and easy to paint. What I was really going for here was a sort of... I wanted to experiment with... If I'm going to be really pretentious, I was experimenting with object source lighting, don't you know? Which is a really fancy way of saying I wanted them glow effects. I'll show you a zoom in at this point and you might be able to see what I've done. So if you look around the eyes, or the single eye that these scarabs have, these models, by the way, are from 3rd edition. So these are going back to... They came out in 2002. So these models, or the sculpt for these models, is 20 years old. I'm going to show you some in a bit that are older, but anyway. So I don't own an airbrush. For anyone who knows anything about sort of model painting and some of the effects you can get, some of them can be done most easily with an airbrush. I don't have one. So this is just done with a good old-fashioned paintbrush. Yeah, and I just want, you know, the eye to be glowing. And the really nice thing is if you paint something like robots, basically, and you've painted them in a relatively simple scheme, so a lot of them are metallic, then you can make the energy sources and you can make some bits like the eyes and power packs and weapons and things like that glow, and it actually looks quite cool and it doesn't take that long. I might at some point actually put a video out about how to do it because it's really simple. It's not hard in the slightest. Yeah, just show people what it's like. But these are the scarabs. These are the ones I kind of experimented with it on. And then I was just like, well, this has worked, so let's do this on all my crons going forward. Awesome. On which note, we have some immortals. So, again, Necrons, again, Warhammer. These guys are 2nd edition models, so we're going back here to, what, mid-90s? Mid to late 90s? 3rd edition came out in, I think it was 98. So, yeah, these sculpts are probably from the mid-90s. They're all metal. I'm not showing you all of the models I painted, by the way. I'm just showing you... So, for example, I painted 10 of these guys. I'm showing you a shot of 5, and I'll zoom in on one of them in a minute. Like, I don't want to waste your time with all of them. But again, I thought I'd go in for these glow effects. These, like, Necrons are really easy to paint, certainly the way I do it. You just need some black wash and a dry brush, and, you know, it's not particularly difficult. But again, I was going for those glow effects. Sorry, object source lighting. Ha ha ha. Sometimes called OBS. Wait, no. OSL. OBS is video capture software. Damn you, Loki, you have fooled me for the last time. That's almost certainly not the case. You will probably fool me again. Quick, someone start playing the appropriate song. Anyway. So if I give you a zoom in on one of these guys, hopefully you'll see what I've done. So I've got a green glow effect going on for the eyes because I want the eyes glowing. And I've also tried to do a glow effect on the gun. And I've done that in a blue so that we've got a little bit of a contrast going. But also because what the gun that these guys are armed with, I wanted it to be different from some of the other guns. So in my Necron army, guns are color-coded based on what type of gun it is. If it's a Gauss weapon, it's green. If it's a Tesla weapon, it's blue, and so on. The idea is, 1, it adds some sort of cohesiveness. 2, it's kind of cool. And 3, hopefully it helps my opponent in a game actually know what's there. Because the thing is, so these models are from 2nd edition. These models are old. And technically, the weapon that I use with them is not the weapon that is modelled, but the weapon, what the gun they've got looks more like the modern equivalent of the weapon I'm using, and not like the modern equivalent of the weapon they've actually got. Does that make sense? I don't know if it does. Imagine someone came out with a guy who was holding what was clearly an assault rifle. 20 years later, you want him to be using what is very clearly an assault rifle. And so you get him to use that. But the assault rifle now looks different. And so the assault rifle he used to have looks wrong. Maybe I've explained that better, maybe I haven't. Point is, I colour code my guns. And I was actually quite happy with this. So this was it was only the 2nd unit I tried glow effects on. And it was the first that weren't just those little scarabs, let's be honest. But I thought it came out quite well. And so these guys, just for anyone who's not aware, Second edition Necron Immortals are a massive pain in the butt to get your hands on. Like, seriously, the sculpts are old. They're not made anymore. They haven't been made for 20 years or maybe even more. They weren't that many of them in the first place because this used to be an elite unit. These days, less so, but it used to be an elite unit, so you weren't expected to buy many of them. They were only available as single metallic models at the time. So these are made of pewter. And so they're a real pain to get hold of these days. So it's been a little bit of a mission of mine, I suppose, to try and get a full-sized functional squad of second edition Necron Immortals, because I'm a massive sad act. I now own at least one model, in fact at least two models, of every second edition Necron sculpt, because I like my murder death bots, I guess. But anyway, these guys were quite hard to get hold of. I've eventually done it. In fact, I've actually done it with one model spare, and I'm being sad. So that one model is staying in his little blister blister pack for collector purposes, basically. So that's what we're doing with him. Next, the barge. So this is a rather more recent model. This is from the 5th edition release, which, actually, now I think about it, we're still back in sort of 2010 or something for that. So it's now a decade old, but to me it's new, because I remember I sort of dropped out of the hobby for a long time. Now, I haven't repainted this guy completely. I left a lot of the bits that I painted for him intact from the time when I did it. The big problem with this model was I did a silly with it. So I did need to repaint some bits on the two little the pilots, I suppose, that are on the model. But I thought that was just going to be it. Silly me. I left this guy outside to take a picture of it, and the wind got up because I live in the north of England and we're not a million miles from the coast, and blew this guy all over the concrete ground in the yard, and it went smoosh. So I then had to reassemble it, and anyway, it was a bit of a pain, but we got there in the end. You can see I was kind of experimenting at the time with sort of trying to do some glowing going on where you can see the green in between the black segments. Wasn't great, but I was giving it a shot. But I wasn't going to completely repaint this model or anything. So this guy, came out fine. Again, it's not bad enough that I'm going to repaint all of it. I just touched it up here or there, essentially. Now this is not a particularly great picture, but I repainted my wraiths. So again, we're going back to 3rd edition here in 2002. These are metal models. These days, they've completely changed the fluff of these models and the sculpts and the everything. But back in the day, these guys looked like metallic murder death bots with an elongated spine and kind of, I believe it was described as, and I quote, a nightmare assortment of surgical instruments for fingers or something like that. So it's kind of supposed to be a bit grim, but they were hilarious, and they still are, because they can just phase through things. So you're just like, oh, I'm over here, I'm gonna just, they're supposed to be ghostly, so you just sort of waltz through someone's bloke and shank him in the back. It's hilarious. Anyway, these guys are relatively simple to repaint, as you can see. The main thing here was so my colour scheme for these guys is fairly simple. It's basically silver, but they've got the models have a sort of more pronounced bit on the spine, which I tend to paint red. Adds a little bit of contrast, and when you add in the glow effects as well, in my opinion, it leads to models that don't take too long to paint, but tend to look pretty decent. So we got this gentleman. We've then got this chap who's clearly murdered some poor unfortunate soul and kind of splooshed blood everywhere. And then we got this guy who hasn't. But I've still got the glow effects going on in the eyes. They're not the most interesting models for people to look at. I've got another 3 that I need to repaint at some point, and I might add some more detail to the bases. Next. Yes. So I've painted up quite a few of the Necron Warriors. Again, these are old 3rd edition sculpts from 2002. So this picture is to show you what the sort of thing that I was working with. This is what they did look like from my paint job as a 13-year-old, 12-year-old, however old I was when I painted this particular model. Let's be honest, it's not great. This isn't a great picture of the rear. So there's so much wrong with what I used to do. I don't even know where to start. But the point is, it doesn't look particularly good. It just looks messy. So what I was going for was I wanted the metal of their bodies to be tarnished, so I put a brown ink over them. But because I was a bit of a donut and didn't really know what I was doing, I dry brushed a brown ink over the silver, the bright silver, to try and get a weathered effect. I didn't really know what I was doing. And at the time, I was still using some enamels, but my mum didn't let me use any nasty chemicals. And I was like, this is when I was, as I say, 10, 11, 12, 13, that sort of age. So I couldn't really use the solvents that you would need to use to properly clean your brushes for an oil-based paint. So my brushes just got ruined really quickly, so I ended up buying lots of cheap brushes that weren't very good. It was just so difficult to get any detail to come out. It's interesting to come back and do them from a 30-year-old's perspective. So the sort of thing I've done with Necron Warriors these days, they look like this. So, the old guy would have had the green rod. It just wasn't in the picture. So this is 6 models. I painted loads of these guys. And hopefully you can see the glow effect going on. I think it's actually come out quite well. So the way these models come is you get these clear plastic green rods. So that's not me. That's just a piece that the model comes with. But I've tried to put a glow on the bits of the gun and the body around that to try and accentuate that so that we've got some glowing going on. So just to zoom in on some of the individual models and you can see what I mean. We've got this gentleman. So the thing with object source lighting is you just kind of think about it with a bit of common sense. Where is the thing that is glowing? And that's, if it's glowing, it's going to cast light onto the stuff around it. So for example, you can see towards the rear of the gun, there's kind of these energy coils that I've decided are glowing. And therefore, I've made sure that the bits of the model that are around that, so you can see the model's chest, or part of the model's chest, the inside of the model's left arm, there's the bottom of the model's face as well, and you might see on one of the models, a bit of the model's leg. They, therefore, have got some of that green colour on them. And it did the eyes as well. Again, I might do a video showing how I actually do these at some point, if it is of interest to anybody. Because anyone who kind of does painting and whatnot, maybe you paint, I don't know, Terminator models, sci-fi, fantasy in particular, you tend to get things that have that sort of glow effect going on, which is quite cool. Another model, and you can hopefully see the sort of thing I'm talking about there with the glow on the chest and the arm and around the coils on the gun. There's another gentleman. And, these all look pretty similar. There's a guy from a bit more of a distance. And there's another one. Again, it's just I've tried to make the glow effect more prominent if the source of the light is held closer to their body, say, and less prominent if it's further away. That one's further away, so I've tried to make it a bit more diffuse. I've actually put some thought into it, good lord. But I thought these guys came out alright, actually. And as I say, I've painted quite a lot of these models at this point. They're easy to knock out, if we're being honest. We then move on to a character model. So this is another 3rd edition model. This is a Necron Lord. So what I was trying to go for here is, one, again, we've still got this glow effect going on, and especially you might be able to see it at the bottom of the staff. I'll see it on another picture in a moment. But 2, I wanted to experiment with the cape. So the cape is actually a green. It didn't work quite as I wanted, so what I was trying to do was give the impression of kind of a green metallic material, if that makes sense. So I kind of built up highlights with the metallic in the same way that I would for the rest of the body, and then tried to go over it with the dark green contrast paint. It's, Dark Angels green contrast paint. The Dark Angels green paint is kind of quite muted, and so the effect didn't work as well as I'd hoped, but nonetheless. You can see the glow for the staff at the bottom there, like on the rear of the model's foot. And also, I think here you can see the red spine section I was talking about, and I've gone round and highlighted each of the individual segments of that. And I think it's come out all right in the end. There's another angle of this dude trying to look like an utter badass. And he's come out all right, I think. We're getting towards the end now, I'm sure you'll be relieved to hear. Or at least the end for this 3-month period. We've then got some 3rd edition Necron Immortals. So although these are more up to date than the 2nd edition ones I showed you earlier on, they're still now 20 years old. Again, this is a time when you used to buy individual metal models in blister packs. Anyone else remember that? Ah, the good old days. Or was it good old days? Because let me tell you, these sculpts are horrible to work with. Metal sculpts where you've got fiddly bits that are liable to break. Oh, they're annoying. Yeah, they do not make me happy. So anyway, zoom in and you can see the sort of thing I've gone for on the glow effects on these gentlemen as well. Around the eyes, from the gun, they're the main sort of glowy sources, and you can see it on this guy as well. And that guy. Hurrah. That's the end of the models that I'd painted over this period. I also had a bunch of Tyranids that I sent to a better place. They've been lying around for ages. Some of them I bought, some of them I've just ended up with from people. And I don't use them, and I hadn't really painted them properly or anything, so I just gave them to a friend of mine who does use them, or does collect that faction, and that was an easy way to get rid of, 17 models? So there we go. So there's my paint skills for the time, or paint effort. The question is, where does the hobby golf score stand? Well, if you count all that up with the scoring scheme I've been using, that leaves me at the end of June on a score of -95. Remember, low scores are good, and we've got a negative number, so a big negative number is what we're aiming for. Now, that might sound very impressive, but as I've alluded to before, there's going to be a bit of a hit in July. As I bought some models off a friend of mine on the cheap. But that's going to knock a good chunk of that out. We'll see how that goes. I haven't actually factored that in yet, so I don't know how many points they're going to be worth. I'm not sure. I reckon that bunch of stuff is probably going to be about 100 points, the way I'm scoring it. So for anyone who doesn't know, just by the way I'm scoring this is So I had a scoring thing for videos because I wanted to put videos out, and most of these have been using that, but recently I've kind of stopped doing that because circumstances were what they were. You can see a previous video if you're curious, and it was just like, I'm just penalising myself for no good reason. So a book was 5 points. If I bought a book, it counted against me. If I'd read a book, it counts for me. No library books don't count because they're library books, they're not mine. Any computer games also counted, but I haven't completed any computer games or anything in that time period. And miniature wise, small 28mm scale miniatures are 1 point. Larger miniatures, imagine sort of a cavalry model where you've got the rider and the mount, or a Space Marine biker, similar idea where you've got a rider and a mount. They count as 2 points. Vehicles and larger models and sort of monster type models count as 5. And particularly large vehicles count as 10. Basically. And there might be a category reserved for truly mahoosive things, but we'll come to that when we come to it. So basically, bigger things get more points one way or the other. So I will count up that bunch of communist space cows at some point, but I haven't done so yet. Anyway, I will now stop waffling. I hope you guys found that even perhaps vaguely entertaining. Let us know if you would be interested, maybe, in seeing a quick and easy way to paint some glow effects on things, especially for anyone out there who does do any little hobby bits here or there. as I say, it does kind of work quite nicely, especially for things like sci-fi settings or some fantasy settings. You know, there's a giant glowing skull or whatever it might happen to be. You know, fear my power cell of, well, power. Yay. Anyway, I'll stop waffling now. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you guys are having good fun doing whatever it is you're doing. I hope the microphone's still holding up, and I will catch you guys in another one. Ciao, ciao.